pharmacology course series, I will always put a list of drugs that are fair game for the exam on the slide after the objectives. Items in red are really important for exam success. Hint, hint, wink, wink. Why do xenobiotics undergo biotransformation anyway? Many pharmacologically active substances are highly lipophilic, and lipophilic agents, as we know, are absorbed, reabsorbed from the GI tract in the kidney, thus they can hang about in the body. In order to trap the xenobiotic outside the body modifies the xenobiotic chemically, which is catalyzed by enzymes, to make it more hydrophilic. Biotransformation is categorized into two phases. Not all drugs undergo biotransformation, and not all drugs undergo both phases, where they do undergo biotransformation. The purpose of phase 1 is generally to add a place where a very hydrophilic moiety can be added in a phase 2 conjugation, either through adding or unmasking a reactive functional group. Alcohol, like many drugs, especially those lipophilic enough to penetrate the blood-brain barrier, is metabolized via an enzyme known as CYP450-2E1. In phase 1, a reactive chemical group is added so that in phase 2, in a conjugation reaction, a highly water-soluble moiety can be added. Not all meds undergo biotransformation. Some only undergo phase 1, some others only undergo phase 2. In the example at the bottom of the slide, naphthalene is a highly lipophilic substance without any active moiety, so in phase 1, enzymes in the CYP450 system catalyze the addition of an epoxy group. Next, glutathione is added to that oxygen to form a metabolite that's freely eliminated in the urine. In the pie chart of this slide, the slices represent drug biotransformation catalyzed by different members of the cytochrome oxidase P450 or CYP450 system. The largest area in green indicates that the CYP3A4 and 3A5 isoenzymes are responsible for the largest portion of drug biotransformation. The liver is a primary site of biotransformation, though other tissues may express some enzymes needed to catalyze the chemical reactions. For example, in the synthesis of some gonadal steroids. The mixed function oxidases are called cytochrome oxidase P450 system because the enzymes, when extracted into solution, placed under UV spectrophotometry, they're going to absorb UV radiation at a peak value of 450 nanometers, hence the name P450. Also, for your information on nomenclature, where you see the 3A4, the 3 refers to the gene family that codes for the enzyme, the letter A refers to the subfamily, and the number 4 is the specific isoenzyme. It doesn't really tell you much about what it does, but more about where it comes from. There's significant genetic variation that can lead to alterations in drug efficacy, side effects, and toxicity. CYP enzymes may be inhibited either through direct competition for active sites or through allosteric inhibition. When the enzyme is inhibited, clearance for the substance degraded by that enzyme goes down. These enzymes can also be induced. The substance can cause the liver to increase expression of the enzymes. Think about bodybuilders beefing up through exercise. It usually takes a little bit of time, though occasionally we may see allosteric activation. Here's an analogy of non-competitive enzyme inhibition. When it's non-competitive, allosteric, we can't outcompete it. It prevents the substrate, drug to be metabolized, from binding to the enzyme's active catalytic site, so the drug remains unbiotransformed in its native state. This is an example of a CYP interaction chart. The columns are headed by the specific isoenzymes that impact or are impacted by the drugs listed beneath. In the first row, we see some drugs that are deactivated by the isoenzyme in the column header. This is the most common scenario. The drugs that I selected to publish here are either very toxic or have a high risk of interaction if another drug impacts the enzyme. The list is not all-inclusive. The most common scenario, again, is that the drug action is decreased, the drug is deactivated by enzymatic modification, including my drug of choice, caffeine, that you see in red under CYP1A2. But such is not always the case. In the second row, we see substances whose activity is actually increased or altered by the enzymatic modification. Codeine is a prodrug, a drug that lacks inherent activity until its active metabolite, morphine, is formed, catalyzed by CYP2D6. Acetaminophen is itself active but forms a toxic metabolite in a reaction catalyzed by CYP2E1. The third row lists some drugs that inhibit isoenzymes, thereby preventing the enzyme from impacting the disposition of the drugs in the first two rows. The last row lists some enzyme inducers. These substances cause increased expression of the enzyme, therefore the reactions catalyzed by the enzyme occur more quickly. Drug interactions that occur at the level of CYP metabolism are often very dangerous, particularly when the substrate drug is very toxic. Let's look at a few scenarios involving the drugs that you need to know, those that are in red. First, let's look at my favorite, caffeine. Caffeine's effects are increased wakefulness, increased heart rate, and sometimes anxiety. I've taken advantage of the interactions between the antibiotic ciprofloxacin and caffeine. Because ciprofloxacin inhibits CYP1A2, in the presence of ciprofloxacin, my caffeine is not as rapidly metabolized, so its effects happily last longer. As a caffeine achiever, I'd never want to be a chronic consumer of charcoal broiled meats, nor would I want to smoke, since doing so would increase the number of copies of the enzyme. Therefore, my caffeine wouldn't last as long. Unfortunately, I do love Brussels sprouts and cabbage. As cruciferous vegetables, they induce 1A2 and make the caffeine disappear more rapidly from my circulation. Next, look at the inactive drug codeine. It has to be activated by CYP2D6. If I inhibit CYP2D6, for example by taking the drug fluoxetine, also known as Prozac, codeine will produce no beneficial effect. Acetaminophen, the generic name for Tylenol, is at normal levels of normal metabolism, pretty benign, but if I chronically ingest ethanol, I'm going to induce the enzymes of CYP2E1 that cause formation of an acetaminophen metabolite that's toxic to the liver. Grapefruit juice is an inhibitor of CYP3A4. It can cause the accumulation and therefore toxicity of many drugs. The antibiotic rifampin is a broad inducer that can lead to loss of efficacy of many drugs, as can the herb Hypericum perforatum, also known as St. John's wort. It's an inducer of CYP3A4. Again, not all drugs undergo biotransformation. Some drugs are actually activated by biotransformation, and some drugs undergo toxification in the process. When toxification occurs, the liver is often the target of toxicity. Why do you think so? Well, it's because it's the liver that's forming the toxin, so the liver is exposed to a high concentration. Most commonly, again, drugs are deactivated by biotransformation. This chart sums up most of the possibilities for CYP phase 1 drug interactions. Beneath A, we find interactions that lead to increased activity of the object or victim drug, like caffeine or acetaminophen in the previous examples. If an active drug like caffeine is deactivated by the enzyme, and you inhibit the enzyme, such as with ciprofloxacin, the caffeine will accumulate and you may see toxicity. If an inactive prodrug like codeine or a drug with a toxic metabolite like acetaminophen is combined with an enzyme inducer, for example ethanol, you might see greater activity or you may see toxicity, as in the case of acetaminophen. Finally, if an active substance that's deactivated by biotransformation, like caffeine, was combined for a long time with an enzyme inducer like Brussels sprouts, you'll see excess caffeine activity over time after the person quits eating Brussels sprouts as the enzyme induction reverses. Under B, we see interactions that lead to less than expected drug activity. In this scenario, either inducing the enzymes, making more copies of the enzyme or activating it, that lead to drug deactivation, or if you inhibit the enzymes that activate a prodrug, are possible causes of loss or less than drug efficacy than you expect. Again, the pie chart on this slide shows the relative enzyme responsibility for phase 2 conjugation reactions. We see that UGT is the biggest slice in green, uridine glucuronidyltransferase. In phase 2, our enzymes may similarly be induced or inhibited and are subject to genetic polymorphism. Gilbert's syndrome is a syndrome caused by a polymorphism in the gene coding for UGT that leads to loss of uridine glucuronidyltransferase activity. Patients with Gilbert's disease often suffer jaundice because they have difficulty making bilirubin more soluble through glucuronidation. When a substance, often a drug, displaces unconjugated bilirubin from albumin, jaundice may occur. Jaundice may also occur when a drug outcompetes bilirubin for the limited amount of UGT enzyme function available. Table 4-3 from the text associates different conjugation reactions with the cofactor and enzyme responsible. Glucuronidation is catalyzed by the enzyme UDP glucuronidyltransferase, often abbreviated UGT. Another important enzyme is N-acetyltransferase, which transfers the acetyl group from acetyl-CoA to amine moieties. Other important conjugations involve the addition of glutathione, catalyzed by glutathione S-transferase or GST, glycine, sulfate, catalyzed by sulfotransferase SULT, and methyl groups by thiopurine methyltransferase TPMT. Some substances can actually undergo conjugation with water. Many of the isoenzymes involved have nomenclature similar to that of the CYP, for example UGT1A2. This is an example of a Flockhart table. If you get on the internet and you search Flockhart table, this is what you'll see. It's freely available. The tables list substrates, in other words, drugs that are metabolized by a specific CYP isoenzyme, inhibitors of the enzymes, and not seen on this slide, inducers of the enzymes. A few important points about enzyme inhibition and induction. Number 1, Some substrate drugs may be metabolized by multiple isoenzymes that can pick up the slack in the presence of an inhibitor. Substrates that undergo metabolism by a single enzymatic pathway are therefore much more susceptible to the addition of an inhibitor. Number 2, a person's individual phenotype often plays a role in the severity of the interaction. Number 3, not all pharmacokinetic drug interactions are clinically significant. And finally, number 4, sometimes we actually use these interactions for benefit.